Most people interested in World War II understand that Heinrich Himmler was more than just the head of the SS. They know he was an archivist of German heritage, a believer in the superiority of the Aryan bloodline. But to categorize Himmler simply as a racist ideologue misses a crucial, driving component of his psychology. His worldview wasn't just political, it was deeply, fundamentally supernatural. He wasn't merely implementing a policy of genocide. He believed he was fighting a spiritual war against forces he believed had cursed the Germanic soul for millennia. This wasn't a casual interest, it was an operational framework, and to understand how this manifested, we have to look beyond the well-documented ceremonies at Wewelsburg or the expeditions of the Ahnenerbe. We have to look at a place that seems like the setting for a Gothic novel, but was in fact a very real piece of Himmler's dark portfolio, Houska Castle. Tucked away in the forest north of Prague, this fortress wasn't built to keep enemies out, but to keep something in. And when the SS took it over, they weren't just occupying a building, they were seizing a weapon. To understand why Houska Castle mattered to Himmler, you first have to understand that the castle itself defies all military logic. It sits on a remote, windswept cliff in Bohemia, about an hour from Prague. There's no source of water nearby. It isn't positioned near any major trade routes. It has no outer fortifications to speak of. From a strategic defense perspective, its location is useless. Yet when you look at its construction, a strange picture emerges. The walls of the inner courtyard are fortified, but they face inward. The chapel, adorned with fading frescoes of strange, demonic-looking creatures and animal-human hybrids, is built directly over what appears to be a large fissure in the rock. Local legend, predating the Nazi occupation by centuries, claims this is a gateway to hell, a bottomless pit from which creatures emerged. According to folklore, prisoners condemned to death were once offered a pardon to be lowered into the hole. The first one lowered began screaming within seconds. When they pulled him back up, his hair had turned white and he looked as if he had aged 3 decades. He never spoke of what he saw. The castle was built not to repel a human army, but to seal something away, to trap it within the thickest walls directly above that crack in the earth. For most of history, this was just a myth. But for Heinrich Himmler, a place like this wasn't a myth. It was a potential source of power. We have to step back for a moment and look at how Himmler structured the SS. He wasn't interested in creating a simple paramilitary police force. He was building a religious order. He saw himself as the successor to Heinrich the Fowler, the medieval Saxon duke. He viewed his SS men as a new iteration of the Teutonic Knights, or the Knights Templar, an elite caste sworn to blood purity and ancient Germanic paganism. This was the core of his so-called political religion. He rejected conventional Christianity as a weak Semitic import. He sought to replace it with a mystic ancestral heritage. He believed in concepts like the transmigration of souls, and honestly, he even consulted astrologers and spiritualists. He even purchased manuals on pendulum magic and dowsing, believing in a Gnostic force called the Odd. This wasn't just a hobby, it was the lens through which he viewed geopolitics. He believed that occult forces, manipulated by Jews, Freemasons, and the Catholics, had been pulling the strings of history. Therefore, to defeat them, he couldn't just fight a conventional war, he had to fight an occult war. This is why he created the Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Research Society. He sent them to Tibet, to Scandinavia, to search for relics like Thor's hammer or the Holy Grail, which he believed were not just myths, but actual highly advanced Aryan weapons lost to time. So, when the Wehrmacht rolled into the Sudetenland in 1938 and took control of Houska Castle, it wasn't just a strategic outpost. It was a trophy. The occupation of Houska Castle by the German army is a fact. What happened inside during those years from 1938 to 1945 is where history, bleeds into a darker, more speculative realm, but it is essential to understand what the locals observed and what the SS believed they were doing. The castle was taken over by the SS, specifically under the purview of Himmler's organization. Officially, it was used as a depot for confiscated materials. It became a repository for books looted from Jewish and Masonic libraries in Berlin and Hamburg. But consider the logic: why store books in a remote, inhospitable castle with no water and no strategic value? Because to Himmler, these were not just books. They were the intellectual and magical property of the enemy. The Kabbalistic texts of the Jews, the ritualistic knowledge of the Freemasons, These were the spellbooks of the opposing side in a cosmic war. He wasn't just destroying them, he was hoarding them, studying them, concentrating them in a place that was already considered a point of power. Local villagers reported that the SS conducted strange experiments there. There are persistent rumors of medical experiments, but not in the clinical camp-like sense. Villagers spoke of disappearances, of people being taken to the castle, of the SS trying to use the powers of hell for their own purposes. The idea that the SS was trying to summon or weaponize the entities that the medieval castle was built to contain fits perfectly with Himmler's obsession. He believed that if he could tap into that primal, chthonic energy, he could create a force that no conventional army could stand against. The chapel, with its fading frescoes of demonic figures, sat directly above the sealed gateway. It is highly likely that this room, consecrated to Saint Michael the Archangel in the 13th century to contain evil, was repurposed by the SS for rites that inverted that original intent. Ultimately, this dabbling in the dark arts highlights a critical failure in the Nazi command structure, a failure of rationality that had tangible consequences. When you are obsessed with Thor's hammer and the Holy Grail, you are diverting resources, mental energy, and strategic focus away from the brutal reality of industrial warfare. For the survivalist and the student of military history, the lesson here is about the danger of a magical worldview divorced from reality. Himmler was a master of terror and organization, but he was also a man who believed he could bend the universe to his will through ancient rituals. He thought he could use Houska Castle as a kind of arcane battery to power the SS's spiritual armor. But it didn't work. The demons he sought to control were likely just the ones inside his own mind, the ones that drove him to oversee the mechanized slaughter of millions. The experiments at Houska, whatever they were, produced no supernatural weapon that could stop the Red Army or the Western Allies. By 1945, the castle was back in Czech hands. The gateway, if it ever existed, remained sealed, or at least unconquered by the SS. The story of Himmler and Houska Castle matters because it strips away the last veneer of the Nazis as a purely political or military phenomenon. They were, in their upper echelons, a death cult that genuinely believed they were engaged in a supernatural struggle. Forgetting that allows history to repeat itself. It reminds us that ideology, when mixed with mysticism and absolute power, doesn't just lead to bad policy, it leads to a systematic attempt to weaponize the irrational, and that is a threat that requires a different kind of vigilance. If you found this deep dive into the overlooked intersections of history, belief, and strategy valuable, make sure to subscribe to War Machiner. We don't do surface-level summaries. We look at the machinery of war and the minds that operated it. Hit the subscribe button and share this with someone who understands that history's darkest corners hold the most important lessons.